Hello, my name is Matthew Petrie, and I will be doing my student lecture for History of England, the 1714, on the Hundred Years' War. I would begin by discussing an overview and the causes of the Hundred Years' War. The war emerged as a feudal dispute over the Duchy of Aquitaine, and the war was triggered by King Edward III of England making a claim to the French throne. The war saw several military innovations such as artillery and professional standing armies. The war also saw a decline in the idea of chivalry. The war was intermittent with several interruptions due to things such as the Black Death and several years of temporary truces, but the conflict would last a total of 116 years. The war was fought between 5 generations of kings from 2 dynasties over the throne of France. I will now talk about the belligerents in the Hundred Years' War and their allies. The war was mostly fought between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France, loyal to the House of Plantagenet, and the Kingdom of France, loyal to the House of Valois, but other European nations helped both sides. The other allies of the Kingdom of England were the Burgundian state from 1419 to 1435, the Duchy of Brittany, the Kingdom of Portugal, the Kingdom of Navarre, and the Duchy of Gascony. The other allies of the Kingdom of France were the Burgundian state from 1337 to 1419 and from 1435 to 1453, the Duchy of Brittany, the Crown of Castile, the Kingdom of Scotland, Welsh rebels, and the Crown of Aragon, and one of the commanders for the French during a battle was the King of Bohemia. I will now talk about the 3 phases of the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War was divided into 3 main phases, or the Edwardian phase, which lasted from 1337 to 1360, the Caroline phase from 1369 to 1389, and the Lancastrian phase from 1415 to 1453. Each of the 3 phases were ended by one of 3 temporary truces that would interrupt the war. I will now talk about the key battles of the Hundred Years' War. There were many battles during the Hundred Years' War, but there were four main big battles that occurred in the Hundred Years' War that I wanted to talk about. And those 4 battles were the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of La Rochelle, the Battle of Agincourt, and the Battle of Patay. The first of the 4 big battles I wanted to talk about was the Battle of Crécy. The battle was fought on August 26, 1346 in Crécy. The battle was fought between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Bohemia by the participation of their king on the French side. The key commanders were King Edward III, Edward the Black Prince, and the Earl of Northampton for the Kingdom of England. The key commanders for the Kingdom of France and Kingdom of Bohemia were King Philip VI, Charles II, Count of Alençon, King John the Blind of Bohemia, Rudolph, Duke of Lorraine, Louis II, Count of Bleuett, Louis I, Count of Flanders, Charles I, Lord of Monaco, and Antonio Doria. All the commanders on the French Bohemian side, other than King Philip VI, who was wounded, were killed at the battle. The Kingdom of England had 7,000 to 15,000 men, and the French Bohemian force had 20,000 to 30,000, which consisted of 8,000 men at arms, 2,000 to 6,000 crossbowmen, and the rest of the force was infantry, but the total number is unknown. The Kingdom of England lost 100 to 300 men killed, and the French Bohemian force lost 1,542 men at arms killed, and an unknown but heavy infantry losses in terms of men killed. The battle was an English victory, and the battle happened during the Edwardian phase of the Hundred Years' War. I will now move on to talking about the second of the four main battles I wanted to talk about, or the Battle of La Rochelle. The battle was a naval battle fought on June 22nd to 23rd, 1372, off La Rochelle. The battle was fought between the Kingdom of England and the Crown of Castile. The key commanders were the Earl of Pembroke for the Kingdom of England, who was captured, and Ambrosio Boccanegra for the Crown of Castile. The battle was a victory for the Crown of Castile. The Kingdom of England had 14 to 57 ships and barges, and the Crown of Castile had 22 ships. The Kingdom of England lost 48 ships sunk or captured, 800 men killed, and between 100 and 400 knights taken prisoner. The Crown of Castile suffered minor losses, and the battle happened during the Caroline phase of the Hundred Years' War. I will now move on to the third of the four battles I wanted to talk about, or the Battle of Agincourt. The battle was fought on October 25th, 1415, in Agincourt. The battle was fought between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. The key commanders for the Kingdom of England were King Henry V, Edward, Duke of York, who was killed, Thomas Camoys, and Thomas Erpingham, and the key commanders for the Kingdom of France were Charles d'Albret, who was killed, John Le Mangre, who surrendered, Duke of Orleans, who surrendered, Duke of Alençon, who was killed, and Duke of Bourbon, who surrendered. The battle was a victory for the Kingdom of England. The Kingdom of England had 6,000 to 8,100 men, about 5/6 of whom were archers, and the other 1/6 were dismounted men-at-arms with heavy armor. And the Kingdom of France had 14,000 to 15,000 men, or up to 25,000 if counting armed servants, or 10,000 men-at-arms, 4,000 to 5,000 archers and crossbowmen, and up to 10,000 mounted and armed servants, gros valets, present. The Kingdom of England lost up to 600 men killed, 112 identified, and the Kingdom of France lost 6,000 men killed, most of whom were of the French nobility, and 700 to 2,200 men were captured. The battle occurred during the Lancastrian phase of the Hundred Years' War. I will now move on to my discussion of the fourth and final of the four main battles that I wanted to cover, or the Battle of Patay. The battle was fought on June 18th, 1429 in Patay, slightly north of Orleans. The battle was fought between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England. The battle was a victory for the Kingdom of France. The key commanders for the Kingdom of England were John Fastolf, John Talbot, who surrendered, Thomas Baron Scales, who surrendered, and Thomas Rempston, who surrendered. And the key commanders for the Kingdom of France were La Hire, Jean de Xaintrailles, and Antoine de Chabannes. The Kingdom of England had 5,000 men, and the Kingdom of France had 180 knights and 1,300 men-at-arms. The Kingdom of England lost over 2,000 men killed and 2,500 to 4,000 men killed or captured. And the Kingdom of France lost 100 men dead or wounded. The battle occurred during the Lancastrian phase of the Hundred Years' War. I will now talk about the end of the Hundred Years' War and turmoil in England and France, and the temporary truces and Black Death that interrupted the war. The Hundred Years' War would finally come to an end on October 19th, 1453. At different times during the Hundred Years' War, both England and France dealt with civil unrest. The three temporary truces were the Treaty of Bretigny, signed on May 8th, 1360, which would end the Edwardian phase of the Hundred Years' War, the 3-year truce of Lullingham, signed on June 18th, 1389, which would end the Caroline phase of the Hundred Years' War, and the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, which would temporarily stop the Lancastrian phase of the Hundred Years' War before it would continue later. The Black Death would interrupt the Hundred Years' War from 1347 to 1351 and would kill nearly half the population of France and 20 to 33% of the population of England. I will now give a summary of the Hundred Years' War. The Kingdom of France would eventually win and would conquer all of England's possessions in France except for the Pale of Calais. The war would see military innovations like artillery and permanent professional standing armies, and a decline in the practice of chivalry, as previously stated. The war was fought in France, the Low Countries, Great Britain, and the Iberian Peninsula. The war lasted for a total of 116 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. The war was intermittent due to external factors such as several years of temporary truces and the Black Death that would all interrupt the war at different times, as previously stated. The Hundred Years' War was part of the long history of Anglo-French wars, and the Hundred Years' War is divided into 3 different periods that I mentioned earlier that were each separated by one of the 3 temporary truces that I mentioned in the previous slide. This slide has the 5 sources from which I got my information from. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I will leave. I'd say this is Matthew Petrie signing off.